Chapter 20. Orders. He was waiting for her a few steps farther up the block, outside a shoe store. "What's the matter?" she said. "Why were you looking at me like that?" "Something bad has happened," he said. "You know my snakes?" She nodded. "They told me I have to get rid of them." "What? Who told you?" "Brenda Beeson. I went home for lunch, and there was a note for me in the mailbox. It said snakes are touched with evil, and it isn't good to keep them, and I have to get rid of them." "Oh," said Nicky, with a shock of dismay. "Someone must have told her," Grover said. "I think I know who. My so-called friend Martin." Nicky didn't answer. She stared at a man taking the display tables of an on-sale shoes inside for the night. She didn't want to meet Grover's eyes. "He was lurking around outside my shed a few days ago," Grover went on. "Someone was, anyway. He ran away before I could see who it was." He scowled. "I don't want to get rid of my snakes." Nicky felt a sickening dizziness. She couldn't remember, all of a sudden, whose side she was on. Was she God's helper or Grover's friend? Her mind went numb. She didn't know what to say. "I had to tell someone," Grover said. "I saw you in there, so—" He shrugged, looking at her curiously, probably wondering why she was standing there like a dummy. Without her even wanting to, the truth pushed its way out of her. "It wasn't a he," she said, looking down at the sidewalk. "What? Who wasn't?" "It was me, outside your shed. It was me who told her about the snakes." Grover's mouth dropped open. "You? You?" "I've been helping her," Nicky said, "looking for things that are bad. You know, helping her root them out. I didn't know if keeping snakes was bad. I just asked her about it. That's all I did." "Why are you helping her?" Grover said. He flung his hands out and looked at her with an "I can't believe this" expression. "Because I want to fight against evil," Nicky said. "Find trouble spots. Help keep everything on the side of good, so we'll be safe." "You know what they're going to do if I don't get rid of my snakes," Grover said. "What?" "Put one of those bracelet things on me." "Ha!" he cried out suddenly. A woman passing by gave him a startled look. "Let 'em try it. They're never going to touch me." "What bracelet things?" Nicky asked. "You don't know about them?" Grover circled his wrist with his thumb and forefinger. "They hum. They go, mm, mm. Some little non-stop battery thing powers them. You can't get them off, even with a hammer or a hacksaw, because they're made of something incredibly hard. Anybody they say is a sinner gets one. Nobody can talk to a person with a bracelet, and they won't take it off till you either quit sinning or leave." "Leave?" "Leave town. Move somewhere else." "That must be what I've heard then," Nicky said. "Twice I've heard it. There's 3 or 4 people who have them right now. They don't come out much. They don't want to be seen. Jonathan Small has one. So does Ricky Platt." "What did they do wrong?" "I don't know about Ricky, but Jonathan sings," said Grover. "No one is supposed to, since the Prophet said no singing. But he sings these loud show tunes in the shower every morning. His neighbors heard him, and the cops came and snapped the bracelet on him. He said he wouldn't quit singing, but I think he's about ready to change his mind. That bracelet thing drives a person crazy." He twisted his lips in a disgusted way. "A whole lot of people got these letters in their mailboxes. I heard about 2 of them already. The Elwoods got one for yelling at each other. Mariessa Brown got one for smoking. And you should have seen what happened to old Hoyt McCoy. They brought out the whole police force and tried to arrest him. I saw it. I was there." Nicky's heart had started beating rapidly. "Maybe you should let the snakes go," she said. "Why should I?" he said. "What harm are they doing?" "They could bite someone," Nicky said weakly. "There's a lock on the shed. No one goes in there but me." Grover was shouting now, and people passing by were frowning at him. His face took on its wild-eyed look. And anyway, he yelled, they're not even venomous snakes. Nicky stepped back. I'm sorry, she said. I was just trying to, I don't know, do the right thing. She took a deep, shaky breath. If they try to put one of those bracelets on you, what will you do? Run. They won't catch me. Grover's chin jutted out, and his lips pressed together in a hard line. He pointed a finger at her and shook it in her face. You should think about what's the right thing to do, not just take someone's word for it. And with that, he turned around and stalked away, leaving Nicky standing beside the door of the shoe store, with dark feelings swirling through her like storm clouds. The storm in her mind got worse when she tried to sleep that night. She couldn't stop thinking about the blue envelopes. Mrs. Beeson must have given one to every person who was doing something they decided was wrong. How many of them were people Nicky herself had talked about? And were they all going to do what they were told? Or were there others like Grover who would refuse? And what was the right thing to do? She didn't feel well. Her stomach was all unsettled. She lay in bed for a long time, not sleeping, thinking about Grover's snakes, and the humming bracelets, and the prophet, and the president, and God, and about good versus evil, until her mind was a swirl of confusion. Finally, she crept out of bed. She felt her way down the hall, in the dark, to the back stairs, and she tiptoed up to the 3rd floor and into the nursery. Otis, who'd been asleep on the bed that had been Amanda's, jumped down and ran to her, wagging his rear end, and Nicky picked him up and got into the bed herself. She could feel the warm spot where he'd been lying. It was right by her knees. She put him back there and laid one arm across his furry body, and after that she felt better. But she didn't sleep soundly that night. A dark feeling stayed with her. She wasn't sure if it was guilt or dread. End of chapter 20. Ooh. So Nicky's helping do something, but we don't exactly know if it's good or bad yet. So let's find out. Chapter 21. Getting ready for the open house. For the next 2 days, Wednesday and Thursday, Nicky worked with Crystal at Greenhaven, helping her get ready for the open house. Crystal gave her the assignment of cleaning and neatening the rooms on the 3rd floor. We won't bother to make those rooms beautiful, she said, but they can at least be presentable. Get rid of mess and cobwebs, sweep up the dead bugs, take extra furniture down to the basement, that sort of thing. She cast her critical gaze around the front parlor, where they were standing. The rest of the house, she said, has to be as elegant as possible. I think we can manage it. The house has good bones. Once each day, Crystal came up to the 3rd floor to see how the work was going, and Nicky had to quickly close Otis into the hall closet and put the radio on loud to disguise any sounds he might make. Luckily, Crystal wasn't very interested in the rooms on the 3rd floor. All she wanted was for them to not look too awful. She glanced in, said Nicky was doing a good job, and went back downstairs. As she worked, Nicky turned over the problem of goodness in her mind. On Thursday evening, as they were sitting in the kitchen having a dinner of canned soup and soda crackers, and listening to the news on the radio, she asked Crystal her question. "Crystal," she said, "how do you tell if something is good or bad?" Crystal was exhausted from rearranging furniture and hauling boxes of stuff down to the local thrift shop. "You mean like a good or bad book?" she said. "A good or bad movie?" "No," Nicky said. "I mean like something you do. How do you know if it's a good thing to do or not?" On the radio, the news announcer broke off in the middle of a sentence, and there was sudden silence. Then he said, "We have a bulletin from the president. One moment." The president's voice came on, not quite as smooth as usual. Instead of answering Nicky's question, Crystal held up one finger and said, Listen. "One day remains," the president said, "before the deadline we have issued to the phalanx nations. I regret to say no progress has been made. Our resolve is firm. We will not back down in the face of threats from godless evildoers. Citizens should prepare for possible large-scale conflict. Please refer to the Homeland Security website at www. Crystal turned down the radio. She frowned and broke a few soda crackers into her soup. "It sounds bad," she said. "We ought to be all right here, but I'm worried about your mother in the city." "Let's call her then," Nikki said, "and tell her to come." "No, I wouldn't want her traveling right now. I'm not really sure what to do." She turned up the radio again, but the president was finished, and the newsman was reporting on a terrorist group that had taken 100 hostages and was refusing to release them until they swore to follow the one true faith. "Could you answer my question now?" said Nikki, "about how you tell if something is good or bad?" "It's a deep question," Crystal said, "and I'm deeply tired. I guess if I had to answer, I'd say that you look to see if what you're doing causes harm. If it hurts anyone, if so, it's probably not good." "What if it doesn't hurt any people?" Nikki said. "Or even any animals, but it hurts God." "Hurts God? How can God be hurt?" "Well, I mean, if what you do goes against what God says." "You'd have to know what he says then, wouldn't you? Assuming he's up there saying anything." Crystal swallowed a spoonful of soup. "It's too deep for me," she said. "I just want to eat my dinner and go to bed. And by the way, your mom called again and read me another one of those odd postcards from your dad." Nikki jumped up. "Did you write it down? Where is it?" "It's here somewhere." Crystal went out to the hall. "Here." She handed Nikki a scrap of paper. It said, "Dear Rachel and Nikki, how is everything with you? Here it's work as usual. I'm doing all right, though I miss you both. Love, Dad. P.S. Nikki, I was thinking about that movie we went to for your 9th birthday. Wasn't it called Snowblind?" Nikki thought back to when she turned 9. She remembered it well. She and Kate and Sophie had gone ice skating. There was no movie. So this confirmed it. Either her father was losing his mind, or he was sending a message in some sort of code. She would crack it. She was sure she could. She took the postcard messages into her bedroom, spread them out on the bed, and began to study them in earnest. After a while, she had an idea about what the key to the code might be. On Friday morning, Nikki awoke and instantly knew that she had to find out what happened to Grover and his snakes. If he was still mad at her, too bad. She couldn't bear not to know. Crystal said she was meeting Len for breakfast so they could discuss last-minute open house details. "Want to come?" she said, and of course Nikki said no. As soon as Crystal had left, she ran upstairs to feed Otis, take him outside, and when that was done, she headed for Grover's house. It was very cold. Iron-gray clouds hung like a ceiling over the town. Main Street was strangely quiet. As usual, small clusters of people stood inside the stores with TVs on, but when Nikki glanced in, she didn't see the president on the screen. She couldn't tell what was on. It looked like an old movie of some kind, but she didn't stop to wonder about it. She was in a hurry. Granny Carey saw her coming. "You won't find him here," she said as Nikki came up the steps. "I won't? Where is he?" "Up in the woods somewheres. They came and clamped one of those bracelets on him this morning, early, and he took off." Nikki stood still where she was, with one foot on the porch and the other on the step. "A bracelet?" "Yep," said Granny Carey. She pressed her lips together. She said. "Nasty thing." "He didn't go to school?" I doubt it, said Granny Carey. With the noise that thing was making, they'd have probably thrown him out. So he didn't let his snakes go then, said Nicky. Said he didn't see why he should. How did they catch him? He said he'd run. Ambushed him, said Granny Carey. Teddy Crane and that old Bill Willard jumped on him from behind the garage when he set out for school. Then he ran off, and the two of them came here and told us what they'd done. I'm going to find him, said Nicky. Better not, Granny Carey said. His pa's already gone up there after him. No point in you going. You don't know your way around in the woods. He could be anywhere. But that terrorist is in the woods, Nicky said. So I've heard, said Granny Carey, frowning and rocking. It does make a person worry. We've got a lot to worry about today. She waved a hand toward the window, from which came the sound of the TV. That deadline the president said is up. We're waiting to hear if there's going to be a war. End of chapter 21. Neff, welcome in. Hello, hello. How is your day going? He keeps the snakes. He kept his snakes. We think. All we know is he ran off. So did he let his snakes go? Is he going to be back to take care of them? Where did he go? Is he okay? Will they find him? There's so many questions. I have so many questions. I honestly don't remember how this book ends. But so far it's pretty good. I think I like it, and I've said this before, but I think I like it better than the second book. Because there's like more, I don't know, I feel like there's more stuff happening in this one. Where the other, I think the past book felt very stiff, maybe? I don't know if that's the right word, but stale? I don't know. I don't want to say stale in like a bad sense, because it wasn't a bad book, but Luna's so cute. She's sleeping on the chair behind me. Oh, whoops. I opened to the wrong page. There we go. Okay. So, chapter 22. An Indoor Universe. Nicky turned away from Grover's house with her mind whirling. The president's deadline. That's why people were gathered in the stores. They were waiting to hear his announcement. Why was an old movie on, though? Had they started the war without telling anyone? She glanced at the sky, almost expecting to see bombers streaking overhead. She didn't know what to do. It was true that there was no point in trying to find Grover. Even if she did find him, how could she help? And she certainly couldn't keep a war from happening. Her goal number 3 seemed silly now. How could she possibly do anything to help the messed up world? She was just a kid. She walked down the road, hardly noticing where she was going, staring down at the pavement, kicking now and then at a rock. She thought of Grover, a humming bracelet clapped onto his wrist, fleeing up into the mountains, probably where a dangerous person was hiding out. She thought of Hoyt McCoy, accused by police of something he hadn't done. These things were her fault. Somehow she had done wrong by trying to do right. She trudged on until she came to Raven Road, and there she turned left. She hadn't planned to go this way. Her feet just seemed to carry her. When she got to Hoyt McCoy's driveway, her feet stopped. She stared at his no trespassing sign. She gazed up the driveway, past the row of looming trees, to the place where the drive curved around towards the house. Part of her wanted to hurry on past, but another part of her thought she should go in there and tell him she was sorry for what had happened. Was she brave enough? The very thought of it made her stomach shift and her hands get clammy. But she started up the driveway anyhow. She would just knock on the door, apologize very fast, and come away. She was brave enough for that. The house was as dark and silent this time as it had been before. From a distance, she checked the gable window. It was closed. Nothing that looked like a gun or a telescope stuck out of any of the house windows. This gave her courage. When she got closer, she realized Hoyt's car wasn't there. Good. Now, if she just had a bit of paper and a pencil stub in her pocket, as she usually did. But behind her, she heard the sound of an engine and the crackle of gravel. She turned, and there was Hoyt McCoy in his black car, coming toward her. He'd seen her, of course. She couldn't leave. So she waited, with her heart thudding. "Ah," said Hoyt, getting out of the car. "The other trespasser." Nicky managed to speak. I came to say I'm sorry," she stammered, "about what happened." "You mean the invasion of the Beeson police?" "Yeah, well, it was because I thought you were going to shoot me." "I do not shoot people," said Hoyt. He opened the rear door of the car and took out a battered suitcase. "I may not like people, but I do not shoot them." "I just thought," said Nicky, "that you had a gun, aiming out your window." "And my question for you is this." Hoyt set down the suitcase, put his hands on his hips, and glared at her. "Why were you here, on my property, looking at my windows in the first place?" Nicky had no answer for this question. It was no good to say she was trying to do the right thing. Deep down, she'd suspected that looking in windows and snooping around people's houses was probably more wrong than right, no matter what the reason for doing it. So she just stood there, staring at the ground. "But of course I know why," Hoyt McCoy went on. "Brenda Beeson sent you. Did she send the boy too?" "What boy?" "The boy who sneaked behind my house a week ago. The boy who was lurking about when the cops tried to snatch me. Skinny boy, hair falling in his face." "Oh, Grover? No, she didn't send him." For a second, the thought of Grover in the woods came to her. She pushed it away. "Well, I have to go now," she said. She'd done what she came to do. "Wait one moment," said Hoyt McCoy. Nicky's heart gave a bump. "I have just returned from a tense encounter which I believe has had the result I hoped for. That puts me in a rather generous mood. Rare for me." He walked up his front steps and turned to face her. "I'd like to show you," he said, "that a person may be gruff and somewhat on the sloppy side without being a madman or a criminal. But probably you would decline to step inside my house?" "Well, thank you very much," Nicky said, with her heart beating harder, "but I really have to go." "I thought so," said Hoyt. "A wise choice, in general, though in this case unnecessarily cautious. Still, you might be willing just to look in from where you are." He took his keys from his pocket, opened the door, stepped in, and stood to the side so that Nicky could look past him. She saw a wide wall. On either side was an arched opening that led to a room, and down at the end, the hall opened into still another room. Even though it was daytime, the windows were all covered with blinds and curtains. Dim electric light bulbs filled the rooms with a yellowish gloom. Signs of careless housekeeping were everywhere. In the hall, she saw stacks of books on the floor, clothing hanging from doorknobs, a table strewn with loose change and bits of hardware and scraps of paper. From what she could see of the other rooms, they were just as messy. But why was he showing her all this? Shouldn't she turn around and run? She took a few steps backward, but somehow curiosity held her there. "I am not interested," said Hoyt, "in the dull daily world of chat and tidiness, of keeping up appearances, of being nice and polite and well-groomed. No one who doesn't like my looks or my house need ever come near me, and that will suit me well. But my world is in the heavens, both by day and by night. He raised a hand and turned slightly. Watch, he said. Nicky heard the snap of a switch. Instantly, the lights in the house went out, leaving a darkness that would have been complete except for the light from the open front door. Again, a bolt of fear shot through her, and she skittered backwards a few more steps. Was he going to come out from his strange den and grab her? But a moment later, she stood still again, because she saw something happening in the darkness. The walls and the ceiling had begun to glow. Gradually, they changed from black to a deep midnight blue, as if they were not made of plaster, but of glass, like a television screen. Tiny points of light appeared, first just a few here and there, then more and more, until the signs of an untidy daily life receded into the shadows, and the rooms of Hoyt McCoy's house became star-spangled chambers of the night. The effect is better, of course, if the front door isn't standing wide open, said Hoyt. You may come in and see if you like, but if you're still afraid of me, I won't insist. Nicky just stood there, staring and speechless. It took quite a while to customize this house, Hoyt said. People used to peer over the fence, wanting to see how I was remodeling. They were dismayed when the house looked exactly the same after the work was done as before. He laughed, a dry heh-heh. The heavens are my habitat, he said. Also my job, though as a rule I do not speak of it. This reminded Nicky of what Grover had said. Do you crack open the sky? She asked. Hoyt raised his eyebrows. Who told you that? Grover. He said he saw it. Ah, yes, so he did. Hoyt smiled dryly. He's an observant sort. Most people simply write it off as lightning. What is it, then? Not something I choose to speak of at this time, said Hoyt. I have been extraordinarily busy these last few days, involved in some very delicate, high-level conversations. Right now I'm satisfied, but exhausted. Far too exhausted to explain anything. Well, said Nicky, pointing in through the door, all that is really beautiful. It was. It was as if Hoyt's front door had become a portal to the universe. She longed to step inside and see it up close, have it surround her as if she were floating in space, but she still didn't feel quite brave enough. If only Hoyt had been like a kindly old uncle, then she would have. But he was so big and rumpled and shaggy and grouchy, she was still afraid of him, though it did begin to seem that she needn't be. Thank you, she said. I love seeing it. Is it a whole universe? Oh no, said Hoyt. Just a small portion of one universe. Ours. If I had several billion more houses, I might have room for a few other universes as well. Other universes. Nicky thought of her great-grandfather's notes, but she could barely get the idea of one universe into her mind, to say nothing of others. I'd like to see it, she said, but maybe I'll come some other time. Simply ring the bell, said Hoyt. Trespassers are not welcome. Certain selected visitors are. You may include yourself among them. With a brief nod, no smile, he closed the door and the universe disappeared. Back at Greenhaven, Nicky wandered through the house, too stirred up to settle to anything. She gazed at the ancestors in their gold frames. She ran her fingers along the curves of the banister. She stared at her reflection in the great dining room mirror. Up in the nursery, she rocked in the rocking chair beneath the glow of the lamp, holding Otis on her lap and running her hand from his head to his tail, over and over. Around 4:30, when Crystal still wasn't back from wherever she was, she took Otis down for his afternoon outing. To her surprise, there were people on the street, walking as if they had an appointment somewhere. Quickly, she took Otis back upstairs and came down again. As she went out the front door, she saw Martin among the people passing. She ran up to him. "What's happening?" "You didn't hear?" Martin looked down his nose at Nicky. "There's a meeting. Mrs. Beeson called it. She wants to speak to everyone. It's urgent. You should come. It's at the church." "Do you know what it's about?" Nicky asked. "No," said Martin, "but it must be important." He set off down the sidewalk again. "You should come," he said, again, over his shoulder. "And your aunt, too." Crystal wouldn't be interested. Nicky was sure of that. But she herself would go, of course. She had to know what the meeting was about. She dashed back into the house to get her jacket. The sun was down now, and the temperature was dropping. And then she joined the flow of people moving toward the church. End of chapter 22. Fruit Skits, good night. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a wonderful night, a wonderful sleep, a wonderful day, a wonderful weekend, whatever it is you're doing. And thank you for being here for reading time. I keep hearing Luna like shake in her sleep, and it keeps scaring me. Only a little, though. Okay, let's see. I'm hoping we can get through 2 more chapters. At least. At the very least. So let's keep going. I'm addicted to Pal World. Neff, are you? Matt keeps wanting me to get it. Matt keeps wanting me to get it. And I don't know if I want to. I don't know if I want to. He said it's complicated, but in the sense that, like, you have to do a lot of grinding and crafting, which I really like doing. He doesn't. But I just don't know if I want to play something like that right now. I don't know. I don't know. He keeps begging me to, though. It's not that complicated. Maybe, I don't know if he chose the right word, but he probably just doesn't like the fact that you have to, like, grind a bit. He's never been into, like, grinding games or crafting games. But those are my favorites, so we just like different kinds of games, and that's, I think, a hard thing for him to accept. You know? Pal World is both of that. Yeah, and I think that's the thing he's getting frustrated with, but he wants a game that we can both play together that's not Fall Guys, because I really like Fall Guys, but I don't think he really likes it. It's like Ark, but with Pokemon. That's what he said, because I said it was kind of like Pokemon, but also something else, and he was like, no, it's more like Ark, but with Pokemon, and I was like, okay. But I've never seen Ark, so I don't really have a point of reference for that. But I have heard that it's very, like, survival-y. He was getting raided the other day, and he was like, I need to make my base better. I don't know. It just sounds like something that I would not want to do. But I don't know, because everybody's saying good things about it. Like, I don't think I've heard one bad thing about it. So, I don't know. It just hasn't, I haven't been stroked with that, like, need to play it. Hugh, hello! We are reading the Ember series. Welcome. Hello again. How are you doing? Oh my gosh, I keep yawning. I think we need to keep reading so that I don't fall asleep. I read the first and second books. Did you? Did you like them? The first one is by far my favorite. How far in are you? We are about to start chapter 23, and there are 31 chapters in this book. So we're probably like, what, two-thirds done? Three quarters done? Something about that. Something like that. Spoiler. Oh, yeah. If you don't want spoilers, definitely feel free to lurk if you want. If you want. Obviously, no pressure. But just turn your volume way down if you're going to lurk. So you don't get any spoilers. We'll lurk for support, though. Thank you. Appreciated. I always appreciate the lurkers. Lurkers are great. I am, for one, a huge lurker in a lot of streams because I'll just forget that I am talking. And then I realize that I haven't said anything in a while. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm still here. Still here. It happens. It happens. But thank you so much for popping in. I hope you're having a good day. I tend to talk wherever I go. That's, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I'm not much of a talker, but if I have something I can talk about, and, then I'll be there. I'll be there. So at least we're reading because that forces me to talk, right? Oh my god, I keep yawning. Okay. I think I yawned like 3 times in the last minute. So let's keep going. Chapter 23. Stay hydrated. Oh my gosh, you're right. Okay. You're right. Hang on. I'll be there for you. Neff, stop. Stop. You can't have 2 people who do this in the same room. It's not a productive thing. Okay? We're trying to be productive. Only right now, though. Okay. All right. We're hydrated. Let's keep going. Chapter 23, the emergency reading. Oh my god. But it is a production. Okay. The emergency meeting. The emergency meeting. From the uphill and downhill neighborhoods, people converged on Main Street. Frowning, worried-looking men, mothers holding the hands of young children, older children following along, unusually quiet. Everyone was unusually quiet, in fact. When they spoke at all, it was in low voices, just to exchange a few questions. What's this about? Do you know? Have no idea. Must be something serious. Maybe something new from the Prophet? Maybe so. They hurried past the dark windows of the stores, which had closed early, down past the deserted park, down toward the very end of Main Street. A stream of people. Almost all the citizens of Yonwood. Though not quite all, Nicky remembered. Hoyt McCoy wouldn't be here. And Grover wouldn't because he was up in the woods somewhere. And no doubt there were a few other Yonwood citizens who didn't come when Brenda Beeson called. But certainly most of the town was now pouring into the narrow, upright building that was the Church of the Fiery Vision. Once Nicky got past the crush of people at the door, she saw a long room filled with rows of wooden pews. High in the walls were windows of stained glass, but because the sky outside was growing dark, she couldn't make out the pictures in them. The light inside the church was dim, too. It came from candles placed in dozens of spots around the room. They lit up the aisles and the seats, but the space above, up to the ceiling, was a gulf of darkness. Quickly and quietly, people filed into the pews and sat down. Nicky sat toward the back. Then came long moments when nothing happened. People whispered and rustled, waiting. At last, a door opened behind the pulpit, and Mrs. Beeson came out. She climbed up the steps to the pulpit and stood there looking out at the crowd. The whispering immediately died down. There was no hat of any kind today. Mrs. Beeson's hair was fluffed out in a cloud around her head, and she wore a red dress with her round blue tower button pinned to the front. She stood looking out at them in silence for a long time, her eyes flitting from one face to another. At last she spoke. There was a wave of creaks and rustles as everyone leaned forward to hear. "Well, friends," she said, "we're in a dark time." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Our prophet has seen a dreadful disaster in the world's future. It could be the war that might be coming. It could have to do with the terrorists in our woods. the crowd murmured again. But she's also tried to tell us how to be safe from this disaster. I call that a miracle. It's like being taken under God's wing. Mrs. Beeson smiled, and Nicky could tell that the people in the room were feeling that smile's warm glow. And so most of us, Mrs. Beeson went on, have done our best to do what our prophet tells us to do. It's not always easy to know what that is. Sometimes the prophet says things that even I can't interpret. She says, no words, for example. Unless she means swear words, which we don't say anyhow, I must admit I'm mystified. And there's something else she says that until now I thought I must be hearing wrongly. But as danger comes closer, I'm forced to believe she means exactly what she says. Mrs. Beeson paused. She stood still, her blue eyes scanning the crowd. She looked like a queen, Nicky thought, in her ruby red dress, with the light from the candles gilding her hair. The people in the church seemed to hold their breath. Finally, Mrs. Beeson squared her shoulders and spoke. What I'm about to say is for the good of us all, she said. We must be obedient, whether we understand or not. God's ways are beyond our knowing. She paused again for a long time. Tension twisted in Nicky's stomach. People sat so still that the whole room was utterly silent. When Mrs. Beeson spoke next, her voice was hardly above a whisper, but it was so fierce that you could hear every word. Althea has said it over and over, but I haven't wanted to hear it. No dogs, she says. No dogs. It's quite clear. Somehow our dogs are standing in the way. What? Cried a woman a few rows up, but someone else shushed her. Mrs. Beeson's voice rose. Yes, she said, I see it now. I see it in myself, in my own feelings for my little sausage. She leaned forward, gripping the pulpit with both hands. Why should we give an animal love that should go to our families? Why should we give an animal love that should go to God? We have to act, my dear friends. I know it's hard, but the dogs, all of them, must go. Nicky's heart started rapid-fire beating. Dogs must go? What was she saying? A clamor arose from the people in the church. Voices cried, "What?" and "No!" But Mrs. Beeson spread her arms out and stood like an angel about to rise. "Listen," she cried. Everyone grew silent again. "It's painful, I know," she said, "but terrible times demand extraordinary sacrifices. Seems to me what the prophet is saying to us is this. The more we say no to the things of the world, all those things we're too attached to, the more we can say yes to God. It's what I've told you before. When you have faith that you're right, you know it from the bottom of your soul, you're willing to do anything for it. Anything." At that, the people grew silent again. A few stood up and left the church. One man shouted, "She's wrong," as he went out the door. But all the rest stayed. Nicky saw some of them look at each other with stern, brave looks and nod. Then they looked back at her again, waiting for instructions. "It will be like this," she said. "The day after tomorrow, I will send a bus to all dog-owning households. You will put your dog aboard the bus, and the driver will take the dogs to a wild place many miles from here, where the dogs will be free to go back into nature where they belong. No animal will be harmed, and we here in Yonwood will have followed our instructions to the letter. We will be free to love God with all our hearts." Nicky felt as if she'd been set on fire. They won't take Otis, she thought, never. But she realized after a moment that she didn't have to worry about Otis. No one knew that Greenhaven was a dog-owning household. The only people besides herself who knew about Otis were Amanda and Grover, and they wouldn't hurt him. She would keep him safe. She'd be extra super careful when she took him out to pee, and when the house was sold, she'd take him away with her, back to the city. Because she knew now that she would fail at her goal number 1, which was to live at Greenhaven with her parents. She still loved Greenhaven and Yonwood too, but she no longer wanted to live in a place where Mrs. Beeson and her prophet delivered instructions from God. End of chapter 23. Whew, this is getting intense. Intense. I'm seeing how long the next chapter is. Okay, I think we'll get through at least one more, maybe 2, hopefully. Hopefully. We'll see, we'll see. Get a little stretch in. Yawn again, as it is. And I believe there's an ad going right now. I'll take a short little mini break until that's over. Okay, perfect. Welcome back, anyone who was in ads. And here we start with chapter 24, The Bracelet. On Friday morning, as Grover was on his way to school, 2 men had jumped as he passed the car repair garage. They'd been standing behind a gate that led into an alley beside the building, and when Grover came past, they simply stepped out into his path and blocked his way. Before he realized what was happening, each of them grabbed one of his arms. One of them whipped the bracelet out of his pocket, snapped it around Grover's right wrist, clicked a button on a remote control, and the bracelet was activated. It started up its noise. He wrenched free and ran, but by then, of course, it was too late. The noise screamed from his wrist. He shook his arm as if the thing were a scorpion biting him, as if it were a cloud of bees attacking, but there was no stopping it. Get away was all he could think. He ran around the far side of his house and down Woodfield Road, where there were fewer people, though the few he passed stared at him in horror. He didn't look at them. Get away. He ran past the school, staying far out at the edge of the playing fields, past the end of Main Street, where the windows of the Cozy Corner Cafe were still dark, and then, all the time with the noise streaming out behind him like a kite tail, he ran up the path into the woods. When he'd run uphill for 10 minutes or so, he stopped. The whine of the bracelet, zinged around his head like a monster mosquito. He had to do something about it. Though the morning was cold, he was warm from running, so he took off his jacket and the sweatshirt he was wearing underneath it. He put his jacket back on, and he wrapped the sweatshirt around his wrist, tying it tight as he could by the sleeves. It made his arm into a sort of club with a great lump at the end. The sound was deadened, but not silenced. He could still hear it, and of course, anyone walking in the woods, human or animal, would be able to hear it too. So he unwound the sweatshirt. He took off his jacket and his t-shirt, put his jacket back on, because he wouldn't be able to once he'd had his hand into a club, and wrapped the t-shirt around the bracelet as a first layer. Then he wrapped the sweatshirt around that. This made a wad as big as a soccer ball. His arm looked like a giant lollipop. It might make a good weapon, he thought. Too bad Teddy Crane and Bill Willard weren't around for him to clobber. The double wrapping muted the noise of the bracelet down to a faint hum. It was good enough. Grover strode on. What he was going to do now, he didn't know. He had no plan, other than to escape the town and all the pitying, tut-tutting faces that would be trained on him. People on the street, his teachers, the other kids at school. No, he would figure out a way to get the thing off. He wouldn't go home until he had. He climbed fast, fueled by rage. After half an hour or so, he came to the place he'd been a few days before, where the path led down to the stream. This was a good spot to stop for a moment, he thought. He was thirsty. He'd have a drink. As he knelt by the stream and splashed water into his mouth with his left hand, he remembered the person he'd seen moving through the woods when he was here last. The pale patch off in the distance. For a second, with water dripping down his chin, he stopped moving and listened for footsteps. But as soon as he wasn't making the noise of footsteps himself, crunching over twigs, rustling in the leaves, all he could hear was the thin whine of the bracelet, sounding through its wrappings. Like a faraway siren. So he wiped his wet hand on his pants and walked on. He thought of singing really loud to cover up the noise, but if there was some evil person lurking up here, singing would just attract his attention. He tried to tune his ears to the tweeting of the birds instead. The path wound up the mountainside. Every now and then he came to a place where the trees thinned out and he had a view over the town below. School would have started by now. They'd notice he wasn't there. Would Bill and Teddy have gone to his house after they clapped the bracelet on him and told his parents? Would anyone come looking for him? By midday, he was close to the top of the ridge, and he started to feel hungry. He happened to have a couple of stale crackers in his jacket pocket, so he ate those, but it wasn't much of a lunch. At this season of the year, he wouldn't be able to find much in the woods that he could eat. The berries would be gone, and although there were lots of mushrooms, he didn't know enough about them to tell the edible ones from the poisonous. He would just have to be hungry for a while, that's all. Good thing he'd had a big breakfast. When he came to a small open field, he decided to stop for a while and attack the bracelet. There was a shelf of rock at the edge of the field, large and low. Here he sat down. He unwrapped the sweatshirt from around his wrist, and then the t-shirt. The hideous noise wailed out into the air. Grover winced. It was like having skewers poked in his ears. The bracelet was a flat metal band, about 1/4 of an inch thick, a dull silver color. There was a small hinge at one point on it, and a couple of grooves that went all the way around. The sound came from inside, but Grover couldn't see any way of getting at it. No switch or slot or sliding panel. Maybe he could just slip the thing off. He curled his hand into a tube shape and tried to work the bracelet over his knuckles, but it wouldn't go. He slipped the fingers of his left hand under it and pulled as hard as he could, hoping to break the hinge. But all he accomplished was to make the edge of the bracelet dig into his skin. In furious frustration, he banged the bracelet against the rock, but the silver surface of it was barely even scratched. The noise went on without a pause. Making him want to scream. One more try. He found a rock about the size of a baseball, and placing his wrist on the bigger rock, smashed at the bracelet over and over. After 5 minutes of pounding, he'd made a tiny dent in the bracelet's surface, and a sizable scrape on his hand. With a yell, he flung the rock away and gave up. He put the wrappings back on his wrist. Failure. He lay back on the warm rock and stared at the sky, where a hawk was circling far, far above. What had he done wrong? Nothing. Who was he hurting? No one. So why was he being tortured? He didn't know. Had Althea Tower muttered something about snakes? Was there a law against snakes in some holy book? He didn't know. And he didn't know what he could do about any of it. Stymied, he closed his eyes. The sun shone on him, and he grew sleepy and dozed off. When he woke up, he could see that it was late afternoon. The shadows of the trees crept across the field, and the air had grown chillier. Grover felt bleak. What was he going to do when night came? What would he do tomorrow? He was hungry, and he was cold, too, because with his t-shirt and his sweatshirt wrapped up on his wrist, all he had on was a flannel shirt and his jacket. Which was better, to be warm and have that screaming at him, or to be cold and without the noise. He decided to be cold, at least for the moment. For the first time, he realized that he was going to spend the night up here. He hadn't really thought about it before, when all he wanted was to get away, but he saw what he would have to do. Darkness would fall before he could get down the trail, and he didn't want to be back in town anyway. So he'd better use the daylight that was left to get ready. He'd make himself some sort of den to sleep in, and he'd look as hard as he could for some nuts or shriveled up berries to eat. First, the den. He wanted to be in among the trees, not out in the open. So he crossed to the west side of the field and made his way into the thicket of undergrowth, stamping down brush and breaking off twigs that got in his way. It was like burrowing through barbed wire, he thought. So many stickers and scratchers. Underfoot, the ground was leaf-littered and rocky and uneven. And damp. It wasn't a great place for a camp-out. But after creeping around for a while, he found a sort of scooped-out place in the ground surrounded by a group of pines. The pine needles were thick on the ground, and he mounded them up to make a mattress. This wouldn't be too bad, he thought. Now for food. A few rays of sunlight still fell across the top of the mountain and lit up the trees on the other side of the field. Grover started to make his way out of the woods, back through the brush the way he'd come. But just as he got to the edge of the clearing, he saw, within the trees on the opposite side, something white moving. He stood still. The trees would hide him, he thought, if he didn't move. If he only had binoculars. His heart began a quick, steady thudding. Could the terrorist hear the faint hum of the bracelet? The white patch moved slowly. It seemed to be coming toward the clearing. Grover held his breath. He squinted, trying to see more clearly in the failing light. The white patch moved, stood still, moved again, and at last came out from the shelter of the trees and into the field. And Grover's heart gave a great lurch. This terrorist was not human. And it was not a terrorist either. It was a bear. A white bear. Something Grover had never seen or heard of. The bear came out into the field. It walked with a lopsided motion, as if maybe one of its feet hurt. Its nose was down. Its head swung slightly from side to side. Its coat, Grover could see, was not pure white at all. It was a dirty cream color, smudged with gray. It came closer. Grover held his breath. He didn't really think the bear would attack him. He'd caught sight of bears up here before, and he knew that the main thing was to not take the bear by surprise. Make a noise, let it know you were there, and it would turn around and shuffle off. Still, he was nervous. It was almost night. He was all alone, and he was making a strange noise the bear would soon start to hear. And as soon as he had that thought, the bear lifted its head. It stopped moving and looked straight toward Grover. The last rays of the sun shone on its small round ears, turning them pink. So Grover did what he knew he should do. He stepped out from the trees and stood in the open. He raised his right arm so that the humming ball at the end of it stood up in the air like a stop sign. In as strong a voice as he could muster, he called out, "Bear, here I am. I'm your friend, not your dinner." They stared at each other. Grover saw that the bear's nose was a pale tan, and its eyes shone in the slanting sunlight like little rubies. He called out again, waving his arm. "I see what you are," he said. "You should get away from here. You're not safe." And as if it understood, the bear turned away. It didn't hurry. It turned around and trundled back the way it had come. In a few minutes, it had gone into the woods and disappeared. Grover slept that night on his cushion of pine needles. He covered himself with more pine needles, and he used the wad around his wrist as a pillow. The bracelet whined in his ear, and when he finally fell asleep, made its way into his dreams as a screaming jet plane, diving toward him and swooping away over and over. When he awoke in the morning, he was very cold and very hungry, and he knew there was nothing to do but go home. At least it was Saturday. No one would try to make him go to school. End of chapter 24. I think maybe we'll do one more chapter, because then I think it'll be enough to maybe finish the book next time? Possibly? So let's do that. Let's do that. I'll get one more hydration in. And we'll read one more chapter. So I think that's all I'll be able to do anyway. So, chapter 25, The Open House. The house looked beautiful on Saturday morning. Its floors were polished, its paint was bright, and the pieces of furniture that remained were the finest antiques of the lot, and dust-free. Big vases stood here and there, with artistically arranged pine branches and bare twigs arching out of them. Now, Crystal was scuttling among the downstairs rooms, looking for anything that might discourage a buyer. Was there a crack in the plaster? Cover it with an antique portrait in a gold frame. A scuffed place on the floor? Put a Persian rug there. She puttered and fussed, fixed and fidgeted, talking the whole time. The Tiffany lamp. Here would be the perfect spot. And wait, these cushions. Nicky, would you get those green ones from the middle bedroom? That's better. Really, it's looking good. Except for... Hold on a sec. Maybe the leather-topped game table over here? Help me move it, Nicky. Over an hour went by, during which Nicky could not stop thinking about Otis 2 floors above, needing his breakfast, needing to go outside, ready any second to start whining or barking. But Crystal, for once, wasn't in a hurry. At 10 o'clock, she turned on the radio. There ought to be some news, she said. She stopped dashing around and sat down to listen. Nicky listened too. "We're expecting an announcement from the White House at any moment," said the newscaster. "The president's deadline ran out yesterday, but so far there has been no word on the status of the situation." They kept listening, but no announcement came. There was a news report about an earthquake somewhere, and a riot somewhere else, and then something about 2 movie stars getting married. And finally, the announcer came back on and said that there was still no news about the tense international situation and that people should stay tuned. "It's odd," said Crystal, flicking off the radio, "but at least it's not war. Not yet." She went back to work. For another half hour, she wandered around, adding final touches here and there. Finally, she flopped down on the red plush sofa in the front parlor and surveyed what she had done. "Not bad," she said. She checked her watch. 10:42. "We open at 11. Len should be here any minute. "Do you need me any more?" Nicky asked. No, said Crystal, waving a hand. "You go off and play." "Okay," said Nicky. "I just have to get some stuff from upstairs first." Crystal nodded. She reached for a spray bottle and squirted a fine mist at a potted fern. Nicky dashed up the stairs. Poor Otis, poor Otis. If he'd made a puddle on the floor, she wouldn't say a single scolding word. She burst through the door at the top of the stairs, closed it behind her, flung open the nursery door, and there was Otis scrambling backward, yelping and squealing with a desperate tone in his voice. He'd been standing right there, she could picture it, nose to the place where the door would open, waiting for her. She scanned the room. Only one small puddle, which she quickly mopped up. "Okay, Otis," she said, "just a couple more minutes. I'll be really quick." Otis jumped up and down beside her leg. "I know you're hungry, but we have to get out of here first. You have to be incredibly quiet." She hooked Otis's leash to his collar and wound it around his muzzle so he couldn't bark. Then she picked him up and carried him down the hall and down the stairs. She paused at the second floor, listening for Crystal. Heard nothing. Went down the next flight to the door that led to the hall behind the kitchen. Listened again. This time she heard voices. "Looks great," said Len's voice. "You do too." "Well, thanks. You're such a sweetie." That was Crystal. They were by the front door, Nicky thought. Good. She darted into the kitchen, grabbed an apple and a muffin from a bowl on the table, opened the door to the back garden, and shouted, "Bye, I'm leaving. Good luck." Before anyone even answered, she shut the door behind her and took off. It was not a beautiful day for a walk. Gray clouds hung low and dark in the sky, and the air was cold enough to bite. Nicky had on her warmest jacket and a thick knitted scarf around her neck, and a knitted hat that came down over her ears, and she was still chilly. She'd warm up as she walked, probably, but it would be nice if the wind would die down. She snuggled Otis's head up under her chin. At the end of the block, she went around the corner, turned onto Fern Street, and started up the path that led in among the trees. A few yards along, she stopped and set Otis down on the ground. Instantly, he pulled the leash tight, making a beeline for the base of a tree, where he lifted his back leg and sent a stream of pee against the bark. "Good boy," said Nicky. Suddenly she felt happy and free. The cold didn't matter. The woods stretched before her, mysterious, unexplored. No danger of running into the dog-napping Prophet out here, or any of her spies. And if there was a terrorist wandering around in the woods, well, if she saw him, she would just hide, that's all. So they hiked, Nicky striding along on legs that felt strong and glad to be exercised, and Otis zigzagging across the path from one fascinating smell to the next. The ground crackled underfoot, icy dead leaves, brittle twigs, dirt hardened by cold. In all directions stood the endless ranks of gray-brown tree trunks, their bare branches making a dense weave that reminded her of the cross-hatched writing on the old letter. Wind rattled the branches against each other, and here and there a few last rags of leaf fell down. It was a little after 11 o'clock. In a while she'd find a place to sit, and she'd eat the muffin and the apple she had with her. But now all she wanted to do was walk, and walk fast. The trail wound back and forth, always sloping upward, but never very steep. Most of the time, all Nicky could see was the deep forest on both sides, but after a while she came to a clearing where the trees thinned out on the downhill side, and she could look down the mountain and see the roofs of the town below. It looked small and peaceful from here. No people were visible. She tried to make out which house was Greenhaven, but she couldn't tell. It made her a little sad, this view of Yonwood, the place where she had been sure she wanted to live. In her imagination, it had been so perfect, peaceful and beautiful, safe from the troubles of the cities. If someone had told her then that Yonwood was working to battle the forces of evil by building a shield of goodness, she would have been happy to hear it. Those things were exactly what she wanted. How strange that it could all turn out so differently. She walked on. It wasn't a steady walk, because Otis had to stop every few yards and thrust his nose beneath a bush or into the leaf litter that covered the ground. Some spots were so interesting that he had to snuffle in them for quite a while. During these times, Nicky stood still and gazed around her. Birds flitted among the branches, twittering in a muted way. Overhead, clouds moved slowly across the sky, so the forest was sometimes in shadow, sometimes in sunlight. When the sun shone down, crystals of frost and patches of ice glistened like glass. When she walked for an hour or so, she started thinking it was time to rest and time to eat. She looked for somewhere to sit down. A few yards farther on, she came to a fallen tree that lay alongside the trail, covered in a tangle of brown, stickery vines and furred with green moss along the top. She tore the vines away to make a clear space, and she tied her end of Otis's leash to the stump of a branch sticking up from the log. Then she sat down, took the muffin and the apple out of her paper bag, and ate them both, except for the last chunk of muffin which she gave to Otis. She crushed the paper bag into a ball and stuck it in her pocket. That was when she heard the footsteps. There was no mistaking them. Firm and steady, a tramp, 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 that came from her above on the trail, not far, distant. Nicky's heart started racing. Could she duck behind a tree? Crouch down behind this fallen log? But Otis had heard the footsteps too, and after a moment of cocking his head and pricking up his ears, he let out a string of loud barks. So there was no use hiding. Whoever was coming would have heard them already. He would come around the bend in a moment and see them, and Nicky would just have to hope that if it was a terrorist or some sort of wild person, he would have more important things on his mind than a girl eating lunch. So she sat frozen on the log and waited, and in a few seconds the person came around the bend, and it wasn't a terrorist. It was Grover. "Hey!" he cried when he saw her. He stopped and stared. Then he made a face of extreme horror, pulling down the corners of his mouth and making his eyes bulge out. "Aye!" he yelled. "It's a terrifying terrorist! And a savage monster! Save me! Save me!" "Stop that," said Nicky. Relief swept through her, and she grinned. Otis bounded over to Grover and stood up against his legs, and Grover stooped to pet him. With his left hand, because his right was bundled up in a clump of clothes. When he came closer, Nicky could hear the hum of the bracelet. Can I see it?" she said. $5 per view," said Grover. "Come on." So he unwrapped his wrist, and the noise came out loud and shrill in the cold air. Nicky peered at the thing. "It's awful," she said. "You can't break it with a rock or anything?" "Not without breaking my arm, too. I tried." He wrapped it up again. "What are you doing here?" "It's the open house today," Nicky said. "I have to keep Otis away. Not just because of the open house, but the Prophet, too." Grover sat down on the log. "Why?" Nicky told him what Mrs. Beeson had said. "It's tomorrow. She's going to take all the dogs away." Grover responded to this by rearing backward and nearly falling off the log, as if knocked off balance by astonishment. "I am stunned," he said. "Me too," said Nicky. "You don't think she could be right, do you? That dogs take up too much love, which should go to God?" "I don't think so," said Grover, sitting up straight again. Otis sniffed at his wrist, which hummed faintly. "I really don't think so." "But Otis is all right because nobody knows about him. Hardly anybody. You do, but you wouldn't tell, would you?" "Nope," said Grover. He rumpled Otis's ears. "Guess what?" he said. "What?" "I saw the terrorist." "Not really," said Nicky. "Did you?" "I did." He told her about the bear. "It was an albino," he said. "I'm pretty sure it was, because I've never heard of a white bear. Except polar bears, and there aren't any in North Carolina." He looked thoughtful and a little sad. I told it to go away, he said, for its own good. People here don't like things that are different. Was it beautiful? Nicky said. Not really. It was sort of dirty looking. It had smudges on it, and it was limping. Were you afraid? Nicky asked. But Grover didn't answer. He was staring into space with his eyebrows raised. I just thought of something, he said. What? The broken window. I bet it was the bear. Put its foot through the glass. You mean at the restaurant? Right. Snatched up that chicken and snagged the napkin with a claw, I bet. And that blood. She said it was an R, but I always thought it was just a blot. It was bear blood, bet you anything. He explained, and Nicky listened. Bear blood, she said wonderingly. No one guessed. They sat without talking for a few moments. The bracelet hummed beneath its wrappings. You have to get that thing off you, said Nicky. What are you going to do? Grover stood up. The wind was blowing harder now, and dark clouds were coming in from the east. It doesn't matter about my snakes, I guess. I can let them go. I studied them a lot already. And in the summer when I leave, I was going to let them go anyway. Nicky looked up in surprise. You mean you made enough money? I will, said Grover. I made 97 words out of sparkle wash for dishes. That ought to be enough to win. They walked back down the trail together. Grover talked about albino animals most of the way, how rare they are, how he'd never heard of an albino bear before, how some people had considered them sacred in other times and places. Nicky listened with half her attention. A sadness had come over her. She was sad that Grover probably wasn't going to win his contest and go on his expedition, and she was sad that Greenhaven might have a new owner by now, some stranger who wouldn't love it as she did. She felt tired and sad and cold. Overhead, the clouds had gathered and darkened, filling in the whole sky. Looks like it's going to snow, said Grover. End of chapter 25.